Well, this passage is to say it's the end of chapter 7. And let's begin by looking at it this way. A popular character has arisen, and people are following after him. Even some of the law enforcement people like him. And this is making the current establishment kind of nervous. They feel that he is a threat to their way of life, to their understanding of the way things are, that these are a bunch of rubes and idiots that are supporting this guy, but he's getting too popular, and therefore it looks like we need to find some way to get rid of him. Now, if that sounds a bit familiar, it could be Donald Trump in the current age, or it could be Jesus Christ. I am not trying to draw a comparison between those two. There is a chasm of difference between those two individuals. But I do want to call attention to the fact that there is a certain human dynamic that's at work here that takes place no matter where. It took place in ancient Israel. It's taken place throughout the world. It takes place in our own governmental system. It takes place in communist China. It even takes place in a high school where some new kid moves in and proves to be a little bit more popular than the really popular kids would like him to be or her to be. So it's a common dynamic. And the commonality there is when people feel threatened, when something different comes along, the immediate reaction is always to say no to this and to try and find some way to ameliorate that threat, to either get rid of them entirely, as in the ancient world, or maybe to defame them and to destroy their good name in the modern world or in a high school. And the difficulty here is that there's a certain amount of groupthink that goes into it, that we automatically feel that we're being threatened, and therefore anybody who says anything negative about this individual, that must be a good thing. Anybody that says anything positive about them, that must be a bad thing. And one of the things that I think that this past election should show us, regardless of what your party affiliation is simply that it's very, very easy for people to get on a bandwagon. To feel that their guy is all good and their opponent is all bad, and that's just not the case. And while some people say that one of the candidates or both of the candidates or whomever is an existential threat to democracy, which I think is one of the accusations to Trump, no, actually the real threat to the existential threat to democracy is when people no longer are willing to listen to the other side. Because at that point, you're simply attacking each other. And as we've seen before, no house divided against itself can stand. And this is where I think the figure of Nicodemus in this particular passage is so important. Because all the Pharisees and the Sadducees who run the Sanhedrin, they don't like Jesus. They don't want to have anything to do with him. And the only thing they seem to know about him, other than the fact that he's a threat, is that he's from Galilee. And they know their scriptures, and no prophet, certainly no Messiah, is coming from Galilee. The prophet's got to come from Bethlehem. Now, there's a bit of irony going on here, and John uses it from time to time in his gospel, where it's kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that the characters in the story, they don't know something that everybody else knows. Keep in mind that John is being written a good 20 to 30 years after Matthew and Luke, so clearly they probably know the story that, yes, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. But John is just going to let this slide, and he's going to let the people say what they think. And they did not take the time to ask the question of where is Jesus from? What exactly do we really know about him other than we don't like him and that he's a challenge and that he's a threat? But Nicodemus is the one guy that says, now, wait a minute. He's every bit as much a part of the Sanhedrin as anybody else. But notice he was the guy that went to talk to Jesus. And he is the one that says, does our law convict somebody without giving him a fair hearing? And I think that attitude is particularly important, not simply in politics, but in our lives in general. That how often do we make snap judgments about somebody or about some program or whatever it is, and instead of taking the time to actually investigate it, we're simply willing to listen to what everybody else says. We're willing to listen to Twitter and Facebook and various news, well, they're not really news channels, but TV channels that are there simply to be propaganda. And they will never say anything nice about their foes. They'll never say anything bad about the people they're supporting. And so we get wrapped into that. And one of the things to keep in mind is that nobody is immune to this. Just because you're a Democrat or just because you're a Republican does not make you immune from this. Because if you're human, you've got a real chance of falling into this trap. And whenever we do fall into that trap, whenever we start judging people without giving them a fair hearing, whenever we simply go on hearsay, when we do those types of things, we're acting like the Sanhedrin. We're simply not doing the things that really enable us to understand what's really going on in the world and what's really going on with other people. In other words, when we think this way, we forget that other people, whether we like them or not, are still God's children. And once we demonize people, once we say that you're children of the devil, not children of God, and by the way, we're going to get into that because from time to time in John's gospel, Jesus is going to say some very harsh things to the Pharisees and to the Sadducees, but note to whom he's saying these things. But when we forget that people are God's children and we ignore that and we go into demonizing our opponents, then we miss out on the opportunity to learn from others. In fact, one of the things, this is, by the way, not just a Christian insight by any stretch of the imagination. The Dalai Lama, who's obviously one of the leaders in Buddhism, mentions that sometimes our enemies are our greatest teachers, because when we take the time to stop and see, how are we reacting to those individuals? What emotions are they drawing from us? And if we take the time to think about that and meditate upon that, a lot of times we'll learn some things about ourselves. Sometimes we'll see that we're actually simply projecting our own hatreds and our own deficiencies upon somebody else. At other times, we'll be shown the areas that we don't have a lot of courage in. We don't have a lot of faith. We don't have a lot of love or compassion. And so it's good sometimes when we run up against something that just doesn't fit our way of thinking, that we step back and ask ourselves, well, wait a minute, what exactly is going on here? Take a look at ourselves and say, what emotions are coming to the surface? What thoughts are coming to my mind? Am I having any just visceral gut reactions, knee-jerk reactions? And what might be behind them? Am I reading some stuff from other events in my life into the current one? Am I blaming somebody currently for stuff that happened a long time ago? Am I blaming somebody else for my own stuff? There are all these questions that come up that we tend to ignore when we focus simply upon the idea that my opponent is bad, that the new kid in town, there must be something wrong with her. And when we do that, we're just cutting off our nose to spite our face. Not only are we hurting the other person, but we are hurting ourselves. And we're certainly hurting the community to which we belong. And when we set one community against another, one part of a community against another, we cause more and more division and more damage, and then we do become a very real threat to that community. So Nicodemus gives us a model of somebody who has taken the time to say, I'm not going to give in to that. Yes, my training as a Pharisee tells me all these things about Jesus, that in point of fact, he's from the wrong place. He's from the wrong town. I don't think anybody from Galilee should be considered a Messiah. And there are probably a lot of things that he's saying that I'm not sure about. But nevertheless, Nicodemus is willing to take a minute and say, okay, what am I actually seeing here? And remember when he came to Jesus, because this is the second time we've met Nicodemus. When Nicodemus came to Jesus by night and talked to him, one of the first things he says, you must be from God, for nobody could do the things that you do unless you were from God. So he recognizes in the things that Jesus is doing a basic goodness. Even though it doesn't fit his paradigm, even though from his perspective this shouldn't be happening, nevertheless, he's willing to step back and say, maybe God is doing something new. Maybe God is doing something entirely unexpected. And in that dialogue that he has with Jesus, he's even willing to take a certain amount of things that Jesus says that are rather pointed about him, about his lack of comprehension of spiritual things, which had to have gotten his goat. But nevertheless, instead of reacting and getting angry at Jesus, he's willing to step back and listen and learn. And this passage coming now to a feast in the fall, if you figure that Nicodemus probably came to Jesus during the Passover festival, which again is March, April. And now this is the Feast of Tabernacles, which is again September, October. So you've got about 6 months roughly have passed. And Nicodemus has been mulling these things over. He's still not sure. He's not positive that Jesus is the Messiah. He's not sure about all the things that he's been told, but he's not going to close his mind and say, Jesus, we've got to get rid of you. In other words, he does not let the difference that Jesus has, he does not let the threat that Jesus poses become a personal threat to him. Instead, he sees Jesus and there's something new as an opportunity to learn. And I think that this is something that we can put into practice in all sorts of places. Yes, in our political lives, but also in our personal lives. Is there somebody that you tend to just dismiss as being an idiot or a fool? When in point of fact, maybe there's some reasons. And this is one of the things that I think we as a nation are going to have to do. Instead of simply writing people off and saying, well, the only reason that you voted for the other guy is because you're an idiot or un-American or whatever, as long as that attitude is going, you're never going to learn, you're never going to heal. Simply saying, look, you need to think the way that I do is not a recipe for unity. But if you take the time to step back and to take the time to listen and ask yourself, why might somebody think the way they do? What things in their background might cause them to think other than you do? And at that point, when you begin to ask those questions, then you begin to learn and you do begin to heal. I've been watching a show called Ted Lasso on Apple TV. I don't know if I'd recommend it or not. I think it's funny, but you might not. It pushes the envelope a little bit in terms of some things. But anyway, in one particular key scene, Ted Lasso, he plays this really nice guy. He's an American football coach who's been hired by a soccer club, English football, to coach their team, even though he knows nothing about it. But he knows a lot about human beings. In this particular scene, he has this conflict with a guy who really is a bad guy. And they're going to have a dart contest. And the bad guy figures that this is going to be an easy win for him. And they've got a bet going on. And I'm not going to spoil exactly what the bet's about. But he finds out the hard way that actually Ted Lasso is a very good dart player. And at the end of that, Ted says, I found that there are basically two ways that you can approach life. One is by judgment, and the other is by asking questions. And he says that I've learned that I like to ask questions, and that those who tend to judge me generally are people that don't ask questions. And of course, the whole thing of this particular show is that he comes off as kind of a country bumpkin, and how could he possibly do anything well? But he's actually pretty good at what he does. And then, as you might guess, he shows the bad guy just how good a dart player he is. But I like that thought. He says there's two ways that you can approach life. One is by judging, and the other is by asking questions. We tend to judge far more than we like to think. But Nicodemus comes along, and while everybody else is judging and mocking and saying, how could anybody be so stupid as to follow after this Jesus guy? How could anybody be so ignorant of their scriptures to realize that no good thing comes from Galilee? Well, all these people are doing this judgment stuff. Nicodemus is saying, wait a minute, let's ask some questions. And he bases that on the best of his tradition. He says, does our law condemn somebody until we've heard them out, until we've heard witnesses? And so Nicodemus, interestingly enough, is the character here while everybody else is going crazy and ironically disobeying and ignoring their own law, their own good instincts, their own good traditions. Nicodemus is the one who remembers that, no, our law, which we believe was given by God, says that you do not judge. You ask questions, you learn, you discover. And that, I think, is a very powerful message for our day. That instead of judging others and dismissing them as being idiots or commies or fascists or whatever, if we would take the time to simply talk and ask questions about why do you think the way you do? If it's a political thing, why did you vote for Joe Biden? What is it about him, or what is it about Donald Trump that made you say that I think we need Joe Biden? Or if you're a Joe Biden supporter and you can't understand why somebody voted for Donald Trump, maybe you should ask them, why is it? And you might find that it isn't the reason you thought. And this applies, again, not just to politics, though that's kind of the major thing right at this time, but it applies to anything. When somebody says something or does something that you think just makes no sense, instead of dismissing them as an idiot, take the time to ask some questions. Ask the questions of them and ask the questions of yourself. Now, in Nicodemus's case, and this also applies to ours, sometimes people have a lot of barriers about Jesus that have nothing to do with where he was born. Sometimes people think that, well, I couldn't possibly follow Jesus, and then they have various reasons that for them Jesus is sometimes too harsh or judgmental, or more likely they see his followers as being too harsh and too judgmental, and they don't want to be hypocrites. Well, newsflash, we're all hypocrites because all of us hold to ideals that we don't always live up to. And so we need to stop that. We need to realize that, sometimes people's followers do not adequately and accurately represent them, and that all of us have a bit of the hypocrite in us. And sometimes people will raise scientific objections to Jesus. Well, I just don't possibly believe in miracles. How could that kind of stuff ever happen? But if they would take the time to read and to talk to people, they might find that, yes, in point of fact, there are some pretty amazing miracles that do happen in the world. And to simply dismiss them as saying, oh, that couldn't possibly happen, is acting just like a Pharisee. You're being just as much of a fundamentalist as anybody else. If you thought Jerry Falwell was a fundamentalist, if you take that attitude, you're being just as much a fundamentalist as he was, or maybe even more so. And maybe I shouldn't speak ill of the dead. But anyway, you get the point. When we take the time to look at our own biases before we dismiss something, sometimes we can learn some very, very helpful and very, very good things. Sometimes people who are quick to dismiss Jesus because they don't like some bit of Christian doctrine, if they would take the time, even sometimes, to think what's behind that Christian doctrine, they might be surprised that at least initially there's some good reasons for it. If they would take the time to investigate and to see just exactly who it is that Jesus was and is, what he said about himself, what he did, like Nicodemus did, they might come to that point where they discover that Jesus indeed is a being of incredible compassion, incredible love and mercy, but also great insight. That he does accept us as we are, but he will not leave us as we are. That he will continue to challenge us to become the person that we were meant to be. So what is your reaction when something comes across your path that doesn't seem to fit your way of thinking? Some event or some word or some person that doesn't fit into your particular paradigm of seeing the world. What is your initial reaction? Do you judge it and dismiss it as being foolish? If it's a person, do you just automatically assume that they're some kind of idiot or morally evil? Or do you take the time to say, maybe, just maybe, there's something here that I could learn, to take the time to investigate it? Now, it may be that investigating something, you come to the point where you realize that this isn't good stuff, that this is not a good idea. And certainly there's a lot of things that are out there that aren't. But it's much better to be able to say, this is why I believe this, or this is why I need to change, instead of just doing it as a knee-jerk reaction. I want to close with a little story that I think I've mentioned before, but with the COVID, it's kind of hard to remember what you've said and what you haven't. But in one of my churches, there was a young lady, she was a high school student, and she had been in my catechism class or church membership class. And one of the things that I did with her was that I insisted that she read the materials, that she think, that she question all the various and sundry doctrines that are put out there. I didn't want her simply to accept something simply because I said so, or the church said so, or the Bible said so. I wanted her to think these things through. Well, she did that. She was a very good student. But anyway, there was a church meeting that came up a couple of years later, and she was at it, and I don't even remember exactly what the topic was. But I thought it was interesting that she made this observation. She stood up and she said, a lot of times in my classes, a teacher will ask a religious question, and my classmates will all say, well, this is what my church teaches, or this is what my congregation teaches, or what my pastor has said, etc. But then she said, then I can stand up and I'll say, this is what I believe. And the reason she could say that this is what I believe was because, and she actually gave me a very nice compliment, she said, it's because Reverend Stout took the time to make me think for myself. I think that is one of the highest compliments I've ever received in 35 years of ministry. And it's something that all of us need to learn to do, or maybe need to be reminded to do. That when we are confronted with something new, with something that doesn't quite fit our way of thinking, that instead of rejecting it out of hand, we take a few moments, or maybe a lot of moments, to stop, to ask questions of ourselves, and then to ask questions of the person or the idea or whatever that's challenged us, and to work through it. And when we come across those places in the life and ministry of Jesus Christ that we're not sure about, or we didn't know about, or we just don't know what to do with it, then we need to stop and think through, why is Jesus saying this? Why did Jesus do this? Why would John record it this way, or Matthew? What's behind this? What's going on, and how does it connect with my life today? That's the lesson that I think Nicodemus gives to us. And we're going to see him again, by the way. This isn't the end of Nicodemus. He is the perfect model of somebody who is initially challenged and recognizes that Jesus is saying and doing some things that just don't fit with what he learned. And keep in mind, this is a very learned man. But nevertheless, he sees God in action through Jesus. He sees that people are healed, that people do find hope. And because he sees good happening, he's willing to step back and say, okay, I need to know more about this Jesus. So we've been talking about things we're thankful for. Might I simply stretch that and ask, what are some of the things that you see in the world that are genuinely good? And are there some places in the world that you see some good things that you wouldn't expect to find those good things? And if you're looking at the other 70 million Americans that disagreed with you, if you see no good in 70 million people, then maybe you need to look in the mirror, because something is clearly not good in your life. Jesus challenges us to think, to stop, to reflect, and to see the good in others before we see what's wrong, what's evil, what's horrible. And when we take the time to see the good in others, it brings out the good in ourselves. And when we focus upon the good, it gives us greater gratitude. Or to use a Greek word for gratitude, Eucharist. When we come to the table of the Lord, we are coming to see the good in Jesus, to see the good in the community around us, to see the good in the world which God has created, and to see the good which God has placed in us. Let us pray. Our gracious God, we thank you for the challenge and for the example of Nicodemus. And in a world where it is so easy for us to jump to conclusions, to write people off, even large groups of people off, ask that you would remind us that you have placed good in so many different places. And if we would take the time not to judge, but rather to ask questions, honest, good questions, not gotcha ones, that maybe we might discover some things about ourselves and about others and the world around us. And maybe we would come to understand you a little bit more deeply. And we would recognize that in you we have a God, an omniscient, all-knowing being who knows all the good and all the bad in each person, and yet continues to love us. And we have seen the fullness of that love in Jesus, who was willing to confront those who hated him, who was willing to confront their stubbornness and their animosity, and yet nevertheless was willing to go to the cross for them no less than those who loved him. God, help us to be challenged by the love of Jesus and by the example which Nicodemus sets for us. For we ask these things in Jesus' name, and God's people said, amen.